Come take this vineyard you planted and make us new wine. That was pretty resonating with me through that song. Last week, David and Anita introduced us to James, and then they read out loud the entire 5 chapters of the book in the Message translation. James is a beautiful book of wisdom, but it also carries with it a bit of a gut punch. James wants to get into our business and challenge us on how we live. As David mentioned last week, James was the half-brother of Jesus. And I often try to imagine what it was like being the sibling of Jesus. And we know from some of the texts that his family thought he was out of his mind. They actually didn't believe him or follow him. But James was one of the eyewitnesses of the resurrected Jesus. It was at this time that James had a sudden turnaround and believed, and he dedicated his life to proclaiming it, even to the point of death. James was known as a pillar in the Jerusalem church and was also known as a peacemaker who led with wisdom and courage until he was tragically murdered. The book begins with greeting the 12 tribes, which tells us that he's writing to Jewish Christians, all the Messianic Jews who lived outside the land of Israel, who were probably scattered after Stephen's death. James does not read like one of Paul's letters where he addresses specific problems in the church. Rather, James is writing this as a pastor, to instruct and to encourage his dispersed people in the face of their difficulties. The book is a summary of James's sage wisdom for any and every community of Jesus followers. As we, over the next few weeks, as we journey through this book, you will notice that James' wisdom has been heavily influenced by 2 sources. One, the first is Jesus' teaching about life and the kingdom of God, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which he is constantly echoing and quoting in the book. The second influence is the biblical wisdom book of Proverbs, especially the poems in Proverbs 1 through 9. James grew up with Jesus, and the book of Proverbs and Jesus' teachings, so now his teachings sound like them and are stamped by their language and their imagery. Chapter 1 is an introduction and contains all the key words and ideas explored more deeply in chapters 2 through 5. You will also notice that each chapter ends with a catchy one-liner. And I encourage you to continue reading through each chapter and look for these threads. But this afternoon, I'd like to settle into the first part of chapter 1, trials and the testing of our faithfulness. Or as the Message states, faith under pressure. Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open, and it shows its true colors. So don't try and get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work, so you become mature and well-developed and not deficient in any way. And I have to say this, preparing for this was a pure test of my endurance and my perseverance, because this is not a muscle that has been exercised lately, actually in a very long time, and I'm very stiff and sore. And I tried to think of every possible way to get out of this. And hours of trying to gather my thoughts, and there's just so much in this book. And so I don't know if I passed or not, but it's doing its work in me. Let's just put it that way. Consider it a sheer gift, or as the NIV translation says, consider it pure joy when we find ourselves in challenging situations. It is not intuitive that trials would be considered or received as a gift. It is usually not our first reaction or response to find ourselves feeling happy or joyful in the midst of them. We are hardwired for survival. Just look at the world that we live in. We are all under immense pressure, and our faith life is currently being forced into the open. What we believe about God, what we believe about ourselves, is indeed showing its true colors. When we find ourselves in these situations, we often start looking for ways to get out of them. This is normal human behavior. We start grasping at things, try to make reason out of things. It's just how we're wired. We want to make it make sense. Scarcity sets in, and all that we believe about God is laid bare. The father of lies is accusing him to our hearts every single day. Some of us enter into using bargaining prayers, or we find ourselves looking for the next teaching, or we can become desperate searching for the right formula, or maybe if we just say the right prayers and the right decrees, that this will give us our desired outcome. We find ourselves tossed back and forth like the waves by the sheer force of our situation, and we often don't know how to navigate the storm that we find ourselves in. We are walking in the dark, and we can't see. But in the winter season is when the roots go deep and where the most growth happens in a plant, in a tree. And there's things that we don't do in the winter. We don't water. We don't plant. We let our roots go down deep. Navigating the unknown can be very disorientating. We cry out for help, for wisdom, for somebody to turn on the light. But every new day begins with 6 hours of darkness. The Father is always at work. And this morning will come, and light will light our way. But if we endure in this season, we will look back and see that we get both wisdom and light. The beauty of a long life of following Jesus is often the simple gift that we have to reflect back. It is the looking back over our lives and the lives of others that we have walked with, that we have been with, that we have gone step by step in their suffering, in their trials. We can see God's goodness and this glory that is at work within us. But often when we are in the thick of things, it can be very painful and not well with our souls. We find out how fast and how vulnerable we really are in this journey called life. Sometimes when the pain is too great, we find ourselves doing whatever we can to numb it, to disconnect from it, to not feel. This usually only prolongs our healing process and can often lead to more suffering. Brene Brown, she's a doctorate in social work, and she is a story researcher. She sits with people and listens to their trauma and their pain and their shame. And within doing that, she collaborated all the things, and she came to the conclusion that we cannot selectively numb emotion. When we numb the painful emotions like anger, sorrow, shame, we also numb the positive emotions like joy and gratitude. And it is the positive emotions that are needed to navigate hard times. Leaning into the discomfort and feeling all the feels and reaching out for wisdom, and it will be granted. Left to ourselves, we don't usually consider our trials gifts. But this is exactly what James is asking of us, to consider. The word consider has a notion of making a deliberate conscience and rational choice. Not that we rejoice in our pain, but to consider the work of goodness that is being formed in us. This is not a command. James is not demanding anything here, but he does have the big picture view of our purpose as followers of Jesus. James knows and is convinced that our ultimate call and destiny as followers of Jesus is that we would be made complete, perfect, mature, well-formed, and lacking nothing. This is really what the entire book of James is calling us to. And to live it out, fruit that the Spirit is at work in us. The word perfect is really important for James. He repeats it 7 times in the book. In biblical Hebrew and Greek, it refers to wholeness, bringing us back to shalom, peace in the chaos, and unanxious presence. It means living a completely integrated life where your actions are always consistent with the values and the words and the way of Jesus. James knows that most of us live as fractured people, being with big inconsistencies in our character. We are all more compromised than we want to admit. However, God is on a mission to restore fractured people and to make us whole. Pressure itself does not build character. It reveals what is lacking. There's a lot of revealing going on right now in the church, in us individually. We're being pressed on every side. It's perplexing. But it is from this confidence and knowing that James asks us to consider our trials as gifts. And knowing that Jesus is with us and will be faithful to finish the good work he started in us. James also tells us that we are not to consider these temptations and trials from God's hand. Testing comes in a variety of forms, and we are surrounded with some, and we fall into some, and at times we bring some upon ourselves. But James believes that life trials and hardships are paradoxical gifts that can produce endurance and shape our character. And this is the crux of the Beatitudes. There is an eternal outcome at work. Simple declarations of a reality that is not yet seen. It seems upside down, and to most, they often don't make sense. But this is the Jesus way. You are blessed when you feel like you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You are blessed when you are content with just who you are. No more and no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. And you are blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and your heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well developed and not deficient in any way. To endure is to literally to remain under. It means to hang in there when the going gets tough. We are often too quick to cut short the process of endurance. The work of endurance is an inner issue. For example, I say to my friend who is and has been walking through a divorce for quite a few years, and she would phone me, "I'm so lonely." I'm just really, really lonely. And I would say, let it finish its work in you. There's something that God is doing in you. You will lack nothing. This loneliness is doing a work if you let it. And none of us sign up for that stuff. When we ask for wisdom and listen closely to the words of truth, trusting that God is good and responding with action, we begin to experience the wholeness that God designed for us. And those around us experience it too. It spills over, it edifies others. When we can see our sufferings through the wisdom and goodness of God, we are moved to alleviate human suffering whenever we encounter it, especially the sufferings of the most vulnerable in our communities. But when we forget God's goodness, we often allow our pain to provoke selfish actions and cruel words that can destroy ourselves and our communities. There's a lot at stake here. So James urges us to listen carefully and to respond tangibly. God is the author of everything good. In him, there is no darkness. Even the darkness is light to him. So we learn together how to surrender and endure in hard times, asking for wisdom and trusting that the Father is always at work in us and in others. Knowing that God is for us and not against us. God always remains faithful, even when we do not. This is really good news to consider. Like really, really good news to consider. So I challenge us over the next few weeks to continue to read these chapters and let it do a work in us and let it provoke us, because it is very provoking. It's very challenging. Lots gets laid bare in just reading that book. And let us surrender to the work of the Father, who is conforming us into the very image of his Son, that we would be like Jesus, following in his ways, following in his words, and being light in the darkness. Thank you for letting me share.